Hello, everybody. This is Tara from the Elberon Branch Library of the Long Branch Free Public Library, and we are so excited to introduce to you Hope Bolinger. She is an author in her own right. She was the founder of Generation Hope Books, and she is just a delight of a human being. So welcome, Hope, and we look forward to learning how to not to kick the tripod, learning from you in the next hour or so. So thank you and welcome to the Jersey Shore. She's dialing in from Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, hello. Well, I'll go ahead and get us shared. And I don't think we're going to end up taking the whole hour. It's a beautiful day on the day that we're recording this. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it relatively brief, but still packed with good information. Zoom kind of gives me trouble sometimes. Okay, we're good. We are now sharing. It likes to give me trouble sometimes. So hello, everyone. Those who are tuning in and also those who will be watching later. My name is Hope Bolinger, and I'm going to kind of walk you through my personal publishing journey, hopefully with lots of tips and tricks in case you want to dive into the traditional publishing industry yourself. And so I'm going to walk you through what it took for me to be in publishing. And then, of course, I'm always willing to answer any questions during this video or after this video, too. I want to be a wealth of information. So I usually have to have, we just mentioned this before we started recording, I usually have to have a token introduction slide, and you're going to have to, throughout this presentation, you're going to kind of see why I end up having to do this. But I'm a number of things. I am a writer, so I have 25 books that are out or will be out by 2025. So there's a lot going on over here. I'm a publisher. We had mentioned Generation Hope in the introduction, but I also work for a publisher as an acquisitions editor. I'll explain what all is involved in that. I'm a former literary agent. We'll touch on what that is. And also I'm an editor. Every single book that comes through in our publishing house, I'll be at least on one of those rounds of edits. So I do a number of those things. So in addition to all these things, because I'm a writer, I'm going to go ahead and tell you a story. And the story is going to be about two things. You're going to see these themes frequently popping up in this. First of all, this story is going to be about ageism. And I want to mention, because oftentimes I will give this talk for more of a younger audience, but something to be noted about ageism, even though I'm going to be talking about it from the younger end, I've seen it go both ways in publishing. I've seen any-ism show up in publishing. And a lot of this presentation is about fighting back against stereotypes, fighting back against assumptions people may have about you, and learning to overcome those obstacles in an industry that unfortunately has a lot of those obstacles. So we're going to talk about ageism, and we're going to talk about perseverance, pushing through a lot of those assumptions that people had about myself. So we're going to actually start our story in the middle of it, work our way back, and then go forward. I'm going to start the story when I was 19 years old, and I was at a writer's conference. And I was chatting a little bit right before this about how the story was going to show up. So here's the story. I knew at 19 years old that writers' conferences were really important. These were the types of events where you got to meet with industry professionals and they could determine your writing career. And I had done a number of things up to this point to prepare myself for this. So I tried to present myself in the most professional manner possible. I pitched my materials, and I waited to hear back from the literary agent who was sitting across the table from me. And so after I presented everything, she looks me dead in the eyes, and she says, "You're too young. Come back again in 5 to 10 years. Now, of course, I was 19 at the time, and so that may seem very young, but I had done a lot to prepare myself up to this point. Thankfully, I was not the best listener, so I did not take her advice. But unfortunately, this was something I had to deal with pretty early on in the publishing industry. So we're going to go ahead and circle back to when I got started. And I actually got started at 16 years old. And it happened because of a friend I had in high school, pictured there on the left in the photo. I thought this friend was absolutely crazy. And the reason is because she would sit down and write 300 pages at one time. She would write books. And I didn't understand how she could do this because I had never really written anything longer than a stage play. And so I didn't think I had the stamina in me to do something like that. But in the spirit of healthy friendship competition and the fact that we needed to talk about something other than the shows that we were binging at the time, I decided to give it a go. And I loved it so much that I literally wrote 10 books in 2 years. I would write all the time during class, after school, whenever I could. I was constantly writing. And there was something interesting going on as I wrote every single one of these books. I was writing on something similar to Wattpad. Some of you may have heard of Wattpad or similar sites to it. I was writing on a similar site to Wattpad, and every single day I would upload a new chapter. And what happened was I was getting instant feedback. So people would tell me, this is what you're doing well, this is what you need to improve. And so I would take their feedback and I would apply it to the next book that I was writing. So with every single one of those 10 books, I was getting better and better each time. And so by the time I got to the age of 17, I figured, okay, we have 10 books under our belt. I'm pretty sure we're ready to approach the industry professionals at this point. So I started sending out query letters, and I learned really quickly that you can get a lot of rejections. So I didn't hear back much, but I learned that there are 3 types of rejections in this industry. So the most common is that they just won't respond. And this is something I also learned in the job industry as well, which we will go over how I dove into that in a little bit. But that is the most common, is that they just don't get back to you. The second most common is they'll send a boilerplate message to you, basically the same thing they send to every single person. And then the most rare kind, and I've been told that if you get this type of feedback, it means you are really close, is personalized feedback. So they tell you what you did really well and why they ultimately had to turn it down. And actually, back in high school, I had gotten a couple personalized letters. But at this time, I was getting really, really frustrated because it seemed like I just couldn't find an in. So I did what a lot of authors do, and I didn't do it as successfully as some authors, which is when I was 18, I decided to self-publish my first book. And I learned really quickly that self-publishing was not for me. And I have a respect for indie authors who can do really well. It takes a lot of work. And I think I just didn't know what I was getting into when I was 18 years old. So I learned I wanted to go the traditional route myself. And the difference essentially between the 2 types of publishing is self-publishing is what it sounds like. You publish the book yourself. That means that you are in charge of every single step of the process. So you get to choose that book cover, you get to choose when that release date is. However, that also means that you also have to upfront all the costs yourself too. Whereas with traditional publishing, what that means is that a publisher approaches you and says, I want to pay you for your book. But that also means they maintain control of pretty much almost everything in the process. So if they give you a book cover you hate, it's your book cover. So you have to kind of roll with the punches there. But after evaluating these 2, I decided, okay, I think I want to go the traditional route with this. So I decided I really wanted to sneak in and figure out everything I could about the publishing industry so I could understand it from the inside out. So I went to college to study publishing, specifically a professional writing major. So I had 2 goals with that. I wanted to sneak myself in, but I also wanted to sneak other people in. I figured if it is this hard for me to get into publishing, it's got to be hard for everyone else as well. So not only am I going to try to find a way for me to get in, but I'm going to try to eliminate some of those obstacles for other people. So at 19 years old, before that conference, I joined a critique group, which they were brutal in their feedback, but it was really, really helpful. I had dozens of bylines, which essentially just means something that had been published. So think newspaper articles, poetry, plays, short stories. At this point, I had 12 books under my belt. And also I did a number of unpaid internships with publishers, so I could really understand how their processes had worked. So by the time I sat across from that person at the conference, I had done all this stuff. And so a lot of times I get questions from writers saying, well, why do I want to publish shorter things? I really want to write the longer stuff. And hi, sorry, what was that?
From Amazon Shopping, there's a deal on an ebook by John Bonvin.
So what essentially a byline is it tells publishers that you can write more than one thing. So you're essentially a versatile writer. They really do like to hear that writers have at least tried to get their feet wet in different types of writing. So at 19, I decided to ignore that literary agent who told me I was too young, and I kept going to conferences. So, and at one in particular, the one that I'm pictured in this photo, there was a literary agent there. And he had mentioned in some of his classes that I sat in on that he was looking for some younger writers. Since a lot of his writers in his lineup were older, he wanted to have a mix of that. And so I decided, okay, I think I'm ready to pitch him my book. And the reason why oftentimes writers may suggest going to conferences is that industry professionals are essentially there. So you can sit across the table from them, see them eye to eye, and tell them the heart behind your story. And speaking from experience, and apparently not the experience enough to proofread this slide, it's harder to say no when you've seen someone in person, because you know the heart behind their story. And so it's a lot more personal than if you see a slush pile submission in the inbox. And then essentially what a literary agent is a person who can sneak you into the industry. Unfortunately, with most traditional publishers, and I do mean like 90% of them, they are requiring agents now for pretty much most of the submissions that we're seeing. So they're almost pretty much a necessity in the industry. And an agent does a number of other things. They can negotiate contracts for you. They're a mediator for you. They do a lot of stuff. But when I was at this conference, I knew, okay, if I pitch this agent, that's going to help me put my best foot forward if he decides to take me on as a client. So I pitched him, and he seemed semi-interested. I knew he had heard dozens of pitches earlier that day. So he told me, "You're very young, but you're a good writer. I'm going to send you back some edits after this conference, and I'm going to see what you can do, if you can apply feedback that you're given." So I went ahead and sent him my materials, and he sent me 100 hours of edits. But I was determined. I wanted to show him that I was capable of applying feedback that was given to me. So I went ahead and sent it back to him, and he was responding within like 24-hour period. So pretty fast. So I did them roughly in about a week while also doing a number of jobs. And so when I sent them back to him, he had said, "You're very young, but these edits are better than what most of my authors can do." And so at this point, I'm thinking, I have to have an agent at this point. You know, if I am doing the equivalent work of the people he's already signed on, what more do I need to do to prove myself to him? Will he take me on at last? So of course, as editors do, he found more things to be edited. So he sent me some more edits. And so I turned them back into him, and I waited. And I waited some more. It was really unusual not to hear from him after a long period of time, but I waited a professional 8 weeks before I sent a nice follow-up email. And he pretty much ghosted me. I mean, not technically. He did eventually, several months after that, send me a form rejection. But I was so devastated because I was so close to finally getting that really needed industry connection. And it slipped away from my fingers, and I was back to square one. So I figured, okay, maybe I'm not going to get that first goal to get myself into publishing right away, but maybe I can work on that second one, work on getting other people into publishing. So I'm going to keep working internships until I can get a job in the publishing industry where I can sneak other people in. And so when I was 20 years old, I accidentally ended up working for that literary agent who ghosted me. I didn't realize at the time, I didn't realize he was at the same agency I was interning for. And I figured he did not remember me because agents do literally get 10,000 submissions a year. But apparently he did. So after we had a team meeting on Zoom, he asked me to stay afterwards. And he told me the reason why I rejected you was not because of talent, but because I had taken on too many clients and I couldn't justify taking on more. However, we do have another agent at our agency who is currently building her client list. I think your book would be a good fit for her. Why don't you go ahead and send it to her? And so I did. And the funny thing is, to this day, this book has not found a home. And that's a really good thing because this thing needs major edits. But it was enough to convince her. And so I finally had a literary agent. And at this point, I thought it was going to be smooth sailing, that she would, in a couple weeks, get me a book contract. That was not at all the case. And the reason is because there are a lot of literary agents in the industry, which means that publishers can afford to be picky, which means the process was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. So at 20 years old, the same summer that literary agent took me on, I was writing another book. It was a YA suspense thriller. And so my agent sent it out to a number of publishers once we had it polished. And there was one publisher in particular who we thought was the perfect fit for this book. And so we sent it to them, and their pub board got back to us and they said, she's too young and this book is too gritty, which is funny because it is a suspense thriller. So that's kind of a part of the genre. But nevertheless, they did not necessarily want it that first round that we had sent it to them. And I can say this because I've been on a pub board, but what a pub board is, what I like to say they are, is a place where dreams go to die. Essentially, what it is a group of people at a publisher who look at every single manuscript that comes in, and they decide whether or not it'll be a good fit for that company. And unfortunately, more often than not, they're looking for a reason to say no. But the funny thing was, they didn't say no exactly. They had sent a revise and resubmit. So it wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes. And basically, they were asking for edits. And if we learned anything from the agent situation, I can do edits. So I did the edits and I would send it to them, and I'd wait for several more months and they would find more things wrong with it. They kept sending it back to me. I think they just didn't know how to say no. They were like too polite or something. They were determined not to let me in, but I was determined to get published because I had a goal. Of course, after several months of this, you do start to get really, really tired. So at 21 years old, when we were about 9 months into this process, I was getting really, really tired of being strung along. I kind of just wish they would just send me an outright rejection just so we could be done with the whole thing. So when I was on a trip with my mom at Universal Studios, pictured here, I basically told her, I will do one more. I'll do one more edit. And if it's not good enough for them, I think I'm going to just go on hiatus. I'm going to hang up my hat. I'm just going to take a break from writing because maybe clearly I'm just not supposed to be in this business in the first place. So I did just that. I did that final edit and I turned it in. And a couple months later, as we were rolling into the parking lot of our college dorm, after seeing a very sad superhero movie, I was scrolling through my emails because that just seemed to be my life as a college student, was just constantly checking my email. And I had finally gotten the email. So this was pictured in my dorm. I was super sweaty because we didn't have AC, but I was happy because I was finally signing that book contract. So I had finally accomplished the first goal, which was that I had sneaked myself in. But there was a second goal to that, which was, okay, I'm in. Now it's time to get other people in too. So by the time I was 21, I was graduating early. I had also edited about 100 books because I figured one of the best ways to maybe sneak in was in an editing position. At this point, I had about 200 things published, and other book contracts were on the way for my own works. And at this point, I had done about 10 industry-related positions. So I figured that was a really good resume and that the job hunt would not be difficult. And as we learned throughout this entire presentation, hope apparently never learns from past things. So I started applying for jobs. And at 22 years old, and I want to mention this was literally just a month, it was a late 21. I had turned 22 right after I graduated. I had applied to 200 jobs. I was told word for word on interviews, you're too young, or obviously you're young, so you don't have experience. I actually had to even knock off my graduation date off my resume just to be considered for the interview stage. So because none of these 200 jobs I was applying to were biting, I remembered some of the internships I had worked at. And there was one of them that had a low paying job. And when I mean low paying job, I mean at the time in 2019, I was being paid less than minimum wage in my employer's state. So technically illegal, but I knew I wanted to get into publishing. I wanted to sneak other people in. So I was going to figure out a way how. And so at this job, it wasn't exactly sneaking people in, but it was a way to help them. It was a company that essentially taught writers how to get published. So in some ways, I at least was helping people get tips on how to get in. Of course, that job was not sustainable, not paying minimum wage. So at 22, I was working 7 jobs to make ends meet. I had moved into the house that I'm currently teaching from because my parents made it clear they did not want me in the house past 22. So we made it work. And this, of course, happened right as the pandemic hit. So I was at rock bottom once again. And so at one of those 7 jobs I was working at, I was a freelance stringer for an online journal. And I figured that 7 jobs was not sustainable, that I would need to eventually whittle that down to 1 or 2. So a job opened up when I was 23 at this online journal, and I took it. And it wasn't a dream job, but thankfully I was no longer working 7 jobs. So at this point I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm just not meant to have a job in publishing, and that's okay. At least I'm working it on the author side, and eventually I'll get into a job in publishing. And also at the same time, I was working as a literary agent at the time. So I had gotten about 70 books contracts. So although I couldn't work at a publishing house sneaking people in, I could sneak people in that way. But the funny thing about publishing is you never want to burn a bridge, no matter what job you work at, no matter who you meet. Always treat people with kindness is just one of the best philosophies in publishing. So if you remember that low-paying job we mentioned literally 2 seconds ago, because we go through these slides really fast, depending on how Hope talks, there was a woman who had worked on that team there with me, and she had went on to create her own publishing house. She had left that same company, and she remembered my work ethic, that I always wanted to work really hard. And so her publishing house was growing a lot faster than she had anticipated. So she sent me an email when I was 24. So when I was 24, I got an email from her, and it basically said, "You're young and you're just who I need to be an acquisitions editor." She figured that I had a better pulse on the younger markets, and because she wanted to reach them with some of the books that she was putting out, that I was the best man for the task. What an acquisitions editor is essentially someone who chooses which books get to be published at a publishing house. In other words, I finally was able to meet that second goal, which was to sneak other people in. And you would think the story would be over at this point. Obviously, Hope accomplished the 2 goals she had set out to do. I figured at this point, I wouldn't deal with ageism in the publishing industry, that I had entered a position in the industry where finally people would be able to respect me a little bit more. But that was not the case. So when I was 25, I was working at some of the same conferences I used to go to as a writer. And I would have people say some of the darndest things to me before and after classes. Some of the most backhanded compliments about my generation and how I was really smart compared to the people in my generation, stuff like that. It was interesting, the blatant ageist stuff I would get told. And so I was getting frustrated because I thought, is this just going to keep happening until, and it's kind of the curse of having a younger face, but like, is this just going to happen until I'm 40? Like, what is going on here? But I figured that I was not in the same place that I was when I was 16. I was now in a position where I saw a problem in the industry and I could do something about it. So I approached my boss and I had said, is there any way we can form an imprint for younger writers? Obviously, we have a number of other imprints at the company I work for that's for writers of all ages. But is there a way we can do that so there can be one less obstacle for writers who may be dealing with ageism in the industry? What an imprint basically is think of like a baby publishing house within a large publishing house. So for instance, think of a large house as like HarperCollins, and then a baby publishing house in there is going to be like Harper Teen. Although Harper Teen's part of HarperCollins, they kind of do their own thing. So I asked for one of those baby publishing houses for to be inside of our larger one. And she said yes. And I want to be very clear, I did not come up with the name for this. I'm not egotistical. She was the one who came up with it. But we created Generation Hope, which is a publishing house that publishes the work of writers and illustrators who are between the ages of 10 to 24. So in review, I am 26 now, and I'm working a job I did not think I was going to be working at for decades. I have 25 books under contract and about 1,400 things published, and I can help sneak other writers into the industry. So some takeaways. Don't let anyone look down on you for any reason. In my case, it was age, but no matter what obstacles people are putting in your way, or no matter how they are making assumptions about you, don't allow that to put you down. Unfortunately, there's going to be pushback. In publishing, there's just this idea that there's limited pieces to a pie, and that if you take one piece, that you're taking it away from someone else. And that's just honestly not how it works at all. Publishing is constantly changing, and there's room for everyone. So keep going anyway. And that is it. So are there any questions so far?
I'm so blown away by your tenacity and just the hyper focus you had. So thank you for that, because you've already inspired me. And thank you to that publisher. She named it perfectly. What a great gift. I mean, really, that's so well deserved and so professionally right. But I guess my main question is, as somebody who's trying to publish their own things, do you just wait for your timeline to unfold and know when it's time to change it up or stop? Or do you, how long, did you know at a certain point that you had to do something different, or that you could just give up almost? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I know it's going to be different for every single writer. I wish I had like a straightforward answer to that. Because I know some writers have certain submissions policies where they will submit to 10 publishers or 10 agents at a time. And if they're getting all form rejections or no responses at all, then they take it back to critique group and they see what needs to be fixed. Or if they're getting personalized feedback, then they know they're closer and they may just keep submitting it. So I think it just entirely depends, because I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize about publishing is just how long it takes. I know so many writers who, will be in the query trenches for years. So I don't know if there's a straightforward answer in terms of when it's time to set aside something and work on something else. I always say it never hurts to just have multiple projects on hand anyway, just in case if one doesn't work out, maybe another one will. For instance, in the presentation where we were talking about how the one has not found a home. And I think, seeing my writing grow over the years, I basically would have to rewrite the entire thing for it to, I think, be viable in the market now. But at the time I didn't know. I just, thought, okay, we're shopping around this one, I'm going to work on a different one. And it was the different one that I worked on that ended up finding a home. So I know, I'm sorry, that was kind of a roundabout answer. I don't think there's one true answer. I think it never hurts to have multiple projects just in case. but some of them take longer than others. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but there's a project I had that I wrote in 2018, and it's coming out next year. That one took a long time to place, whereas there are some where I approached a publisher and it was like just at the right time and they published it that same year. So every single book's going to have a way different timeline. And I know even like the authors who are super best-selling authors, same deal, where some they wrote forever ago are coming out now, and some they had a much quicker timeline on those.
No, that makes sense. And sometimes there isn't an answer. There just isn't a specific time frame. EJ, did you have any questions?
I did. I had a bit of a silly one. Did carpal tunnel never nearly do you in?
Okay, I'm going to be really honest with you. So not yet, but I think I'm coming really close. I accidentally, this past month and a half, wrote 3 books in the span of 24 days. There were breaks in between each of those books, but I can recommend never doing that ever. So that, yeah, I actually got to the point where I'm like, wow, it's actually hurting. We can't do this for a little bit. So yeah, I'm surprised. I don't know if part of it's because I just have like a lap desk with a nice wrist rest. I don't know if that's helping out or whatnot, but it's a question I've asked myself too, why it hasn't happened yet. So I'm sure it's coming eventually.
Yeah, I will say I don't have the best setup. So sometimes I write 1,000 words and I'm ready to just stay away from the keyboard for a while. But I will say, like, I came to this meeting not knowing that there would be someone who was in publishing to explain things about publishing. And I am also trying to get published. I have 3 books written total. One I actually just finished like really, really recently for a new series that I'm starting, but it's like that there's like this frustration of not knowing why I'm being rejected. I think I've only gotten like 2 not 2 form rejections, 2 like personalized rejections, but one of them wasn't even from the agent themselves. It was from like their interns. So but I will say, like, thank you for explaining all this to me. I've kind of been going through Query Tracker and just slowly making my way down the alphabetical list of agents. I guess I'll keep trying, although like for your revision processes, actually, I know that my book definitely it's good, but it's also 126,000 words. So it needs to be chopped. I'm wondering, I guess, like, what is your normal revision process for your books?
Yeah, this is a great question. I will say at this point, I have written 37. Next will be 37 books. So I will say I've gotten kind of the knack with doing the editing process at the publishing house. I know what editors are mostly looking for now. So what it used to be is not quite what it is, but I can walk you through what it was and what it is now. What it used to be was I had a critique group where I would take a handful of chapters. They would critique it pretty harshly. I would take it back. I would apply their feedback. And then I had like a number of beta readers I would hand it to after, who would look through it and tell me if like there were minor things to be changed after that. I think where it changed was when my first book got picked up by a publishing house, I saw kind of the difference between what critique partners do and then what professional editors are looking for, because the editors may look for like completely different things than what a critique partner does. So once I kind of learned what professional editors are specifically looking for at houses, I found another writer in the industry where we do beta swaps, because she also is an editor in the industry too. So what my process is now is that when I finish a book, I will let it sit for a couple months. I will self-edit it, mostly applying the knowledge that I know from doing editing in the industry and working with editors. And then I'll hand it off to my beta reader. And she'll do the same thing. When she finishes a book, she will let it sit, she'll self-edit, and she'll send it to me. I don't think there's one right way to do the editing process. I think in the initial stages, it never hurts to have as many eyes on it as possible. But I know that was also a roundabout answer, but that is what my process is now, is just usually the beta swapping has been really helpful in terms of her seeing blind spots that I may not have caught, and then vice versa with me catching stuff in hers.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I have been self-editing for a few years now. I can, when you can feel that you're approaching that upper limit of what you can catch. Maybe I can successfully get this down to like 125K, which isn't a lot, but I have like, when you try to ask your friends, like, oh, can you read this? And they're like, yeah, I'll read it. And then they don't read it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, my best suggestion would be if you can find another writer who writes in your genre, do a beta swap. And honestly, writers will have no problems telling you where to cut. And granted, yeah, especially if you're needing to cut some major things, it can even come down to like little words, like instead of saying someone sat down, just saying they sat, because there's no other way to really sit except for down, or instead of stand up, just stand. Sometimes when you cut out just like little filler words, it actually can do wonders in terms of trimming down that word count. I will also say, although maybe, certain publishers, I'm assuming this is more of a high fantasy, high sci-fi type of book.
Yeah, it's YA fantasy. I was writing by the seat of my pants for all of it, also because I wrote it when I was 18. It was originally 198,000 words, and I wrote that in a year. So the 5 years since then has just been me taking out about 70,000 words, 72,000 words.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You're taking a whole book out of that book. Yeah. So I will say, like, it never hurts to have another eye on it because people can be brutal. They can tell you exactly what needs to get cut. So yeah, I would definitely pursue swapping it with someone who also writes in the genre so they understand what you're trying to accomplish, so they don't try to rewrite it themselves. I could go on rants about editors who try to just basically rewrite your book in the way that they would do it. So they're maintaining your voice, but they also maybe can see some areas that you're not necessarily seeing in terms of cutting.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
For sure.
And I will just throw in, it's not a question, but one of the nicest things anyone ever did was send me a specific reject letter. And went over what they liked about it. They were very positive and just said it wasn't right for the time. But I thought it was such a kindness and such publishing's tough. You have not picked an easy industry. It's really like we're talking about timing and writing, and that's just the beginning. So I hope that people who see you on this really take away a lot of the amount of work that goes into getting something published.
Yeah. And also, I will say, as much as I harp on that pub board, I did really appreciate the feedback because they pointed out some things that I didn't even realize were things that needed to get fixed until they did point that out. So I agree with you. And having been on the other side of the desk, when you're working at a literary agency where you do get 10,000 submissions, sure. I always did try to have personalized feedback in the rejections that I would send, unless someone just blatantly didn't follow the rules and send something we didn't take on. But I always try to have something like, here's what you did really well. Here's something that I just noticed you may need to work on. Because that does go a really long way when you have that. And I think it's actually really helpful to hear from different authors in the industry, because no author I've ever talked with had an easy way into the industry. Some may have had slightly more shortcut ways than others, but it's just a tough industry all around. And if anyone is kind of framing it on social media or in general that it was just smooth sailing, that's just not the case. There are a lot of writers who are just trying to go traditional, and it can just be a long ride to get there.
Absolutely. And this is a question I'm not sure I've ever heard an author ask this, but do you have a favorite book of your own?
Yes, I have gotten this question.
Do you? Okay.
I can never answer it because it's like choosing a favorite child. So
right, okay, that's
what
fair.
I will say, I'll answer the question, what has been the most fun book to write? And the answer to that is actually anything I've co-authored. So of the 25 books, 7 of those are co-authored with the person who's my beta swapper, Alyssa Rote. She is just so much fun to write with. We've written a number of we wrote some superhero romances. We wrote some sweet Hallmarky romances together. And it was just so much fun to have another person writing it with you, encouraging you, laughing at your terrible jokes. it was really fun to have someone there in the process with you, because first of all, they take half the word count, so that's nice. But also because it's just, sometimes even like past when you get picked up, there's a lot that goes into from draft to publication. And so having someone work together with you on each stage is just really fun. I play tennis, so I always love doubles more than singles for that reason. So those were the ones I had the most fun with. But in terms of choosing a favorite, I love each book for a different reason. Each one of them was on my heart for a different reason. So I can't pick one. They're like staring at me from the bookshelf over there. I feel like they're judging me if I do that.
I love that. I think that's perfect. Did anyone else have any questions for Hope? Well,
Why do you write?
What genres?
I think it was why do you write?
Why do I write? Yeah. Okay. So a lot of different reasons. I write because I see a lot of people whose voices are not being heard and whose stories need to get told. And I just have it on my heart to write those stories for those people. I also write because I want to encourage people. I mean, I'll have stories that are super gritty, super thriller suspense with cliffhangers, some of those that are a little bit less hopeful, but I always want to be encouraging in my writing just because life can be tough, publishing can be tough. And I always just want people to walk away being encouraged and feeling inspired.
Yeah, I would concur. The great lesson of literature is that we're not alone. So it's good that there's kind of a sense of empathic direction in your motivation. So I think that's great. It's one thing to emote, it's another to evoke the feeling in someone else.
Mm. Yeah. And I think, books are supposed to move us. They're supposed to help us to see things in different perspectives, to see things from perspectives we may not have considered before. So I hope, as much fun as I have with certain books, such as, the superhero ones that we mentioned, I always try to have something that I was a philosophy minor back in college. So I love books that make you think and make you ponder and think about some of those really big concepts. And like you said, have empathy for one another. So that is definitely something I really hope to accomplish in the books I put out.
Yeah, and not to give, defense to, the behavior that's so hidebound in an appropriate word in the publishing industry of this, of the experience you have of what you call ageism, but it's not too hard to imagine that someone took a look at the author of For Whom the Bell Tolls or The Sun Also Rises and know and understand on a brief meeting that they had lived a little and they maybe had some experiences that that probably could be brought forth in the story. I think that was probably the only bias that was really directly working against you in terms of age. I think the real shame was just that simply would just people wouldn't even pick up what you had written. They would just take a look at you or just know that your age was such and that they just wouldn't even bother because it wasn't worth considering.
Mm-hmm.
That's frustrating. So I understand that, but I think it's easy to understand that the traditional publishing industry probably hasn't seen too many people like yourself. When I've submitted stories to different journals in the past, a couple of times I would stick a sticky note on to say I'm looking for the fastest path to rejection, and those are the ones that I got actual personal feedback on.
Hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, I can, whenever I experience some very blatant ageism, I always talked about how I could just have a bingo card for every single conference from some of the very, very explicit stuff I got told. I could always see why the perspective was the way it was. I will argue that I've had some interesting life experiences leading up to before I kind of jumped into writing. And so I think experiences do really help enrich writing. You can sometimes tell in a book when an author has really gone through something. But at the same time, it does make me really sad that just seeing me would be enough to turn someone away or make assumptions. Yeah. So thankfully, sometimes I think I've learned to appreciate being underestimated because, whenever I teach a class at a conference or whenever I'll write on a certain topic or publish a certain book. If someone does underestimate me, hopefully within about the first 10 minutes of that class, they won't be anymore. But yeah, it can be frustrating, but at the same time, because this stuff is happening, I can have a heart for people where the same stuff is happening to them. And I can try to see, okay, what's causing this and how can we break down some of these barriers?
Thank you.
Love
By the
that.
way,
Love that
well done
inclusivity.
presentation and great storytelling as a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have another question, if you don't mind. I actually have several questions now that I've thought about it. I know a lot of authors these days, especially the ones closer to our age and a little bit older, have like a history of writing a lot of fan fictions and then managing to get into publishing. Do you have like a history of fan fiction writing, or were you just all original?
You know, I did actually start, my first book was an X-Men fan fiction. So fan fiction is fun because honestly, even like when we create original content, we are deriving it from stories we've previously read and have heard many, many times. So, I don't think there's ever technically anything that could really be considered completely original out there. So I've seen authors do really well. I'm actually close friends with an author who I think was dominating the Lord of the Rings fan fiction world for a while. I think she was like #1 for a bit of time on Wattpad. So that's where a lot of authors get their start. And then a lot of authors have done really well when they essentially make the characters a little bit more original to them and the storyline a little bit more in their particular world, as opposed to that book's world. So I always, if someone is diving into the world of fan fiction, I say go for it. I think it's a really fun genre to play with, and some authors have done really, really well with it. I didn't continue pursuing that particular route in my personal publishing journey, but I've seen people do well with it.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I started with like I started with Legend of Zelda fan fictions, despite not having played really any of the games. I just watched my brother play, and then I did like Star Wars, and then I stopped for a while. Now every once in a while I'll do a very, very short like Star Wars fan fiction, but otherwise, like, you can tell when sometimes something is a derivative of something, not necessarily in a bad way, but like you can see where the inspiration is. Just because more and more authors are obviously coming out saying like, I still write fan fictions, don't feel bad for it. So I was just curious about that. But then also you said that you went to like conferences, like a lot of conferences. Were those like all in person in your area? Did you have to travel for some?
Yeah. So when I was a writer, all of them were in person. I will say COVID kind of changed the game. So when I was working on staff, I did a number of them that were in the area. I did a number for that company I was working for that kind of taught how to get into publishing. I went to a number of those, and a lot of those were like more in southern states. I saw quite a few that were more toward the Florida, Georgia range, but I do know that most states usually at least have a writer's workshop or some different events, or if not, then at least a bordering state does. So there's plenty I know that go virtual, and usually there are many that have a virtual option in addition to the in-person, but I've been to a mix of them, and there's benefits and downsides to both types. But yes, so I live in Ohio. We actually have a couple that come through here, I think usually during the summer. So I've been to a number of those.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Were most of those like free, or did you end up having to pay for them, or?
So usually they do charge admission, and it differs from workshop to workshop. If you do want to investigate it, I actually recommend like the one-day ones, just because you can kind of pack in most of what you're looking for at a conference within that day. Plus, if you do multi-day ones, they can get exhausting just because you feel like you're almost drinking from a fire hose. I would say the most beneficial parts to conferences, and a lot of conferences know this, which is why they will often ask a lot of agents and editors to be on staff, is the pitch meetings. And don't get me wrong, the classes are really helpful and you can learn lots of up-to-date information about the industry. But the pitch meetings are so huge because you get 10 minutes to essentially pitch an industry professional, and they can give you tips and pointers. And if they do like your pitch, they are essentially asking you to jump over the slush pile and enter priority submissions. So that's kind of the best poll to go to a conference. Although there has been something recently, like the past couple of years, that's been kind of fun, called Twitter pitch parties.
Oh yeah, I've
Where-
seen
and-
those.
Yeah, and it depends on which genre you write, because there's different ones that happen at different times of year. If you throw into a Google search, it should pop right up. But essentially what it is that you pitch your book in a tweet. And if a publisher or an agent likes your tweet, that essentially means please go ahead and submit it to me and I'll put it in priority submissions. So those are really fun too. When I worked as a literary agent, actually quite a few of my clients came from those, just because they were such fun pitches that I had to take a look. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember actually there was DV Mentor, which I'd pitched in for multiple seasons, and then Pit Wars. And unfortunately, I think both of those closed down now.
Gotcha. I know there's still other ones going on. There was actually one recently called Mood Pitch, where essentially people would pitch their books along with mood boards that they had compiled on Pinterest. And so
okay.
I know that was one that happened, I want to say like a couple days ago.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll check that one out then. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Hope, thank you so much. You really brought a face and such a great heart to the industry of publishing, and anybody who watches this will be able to glean so much good information. You had said your email was open.
Yep.
If I can, or do you prefer? Well, I'll put everything at the end of this interview, and I just can't thank you enough. Really, it was a delight meeting you and having you explain so much that, you know, those earthlings amongst us just don't see that side of. And was there anything else you wanted to end on?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you guys so much for coming. And then as you mentioned, I want my email to be open. So if anyone thinks of questions that weren't asked here, or if anyone's watching the replay, definitely please send those my way. I may be limited in some of the answers I can give, even though I've worked quite a few jobs in the industry. I don't know everything, but I can try to at least give whatever knowledge that I can, or at least point you to a resource that can get you that.
That is generous and kind and much appreciated. And thank you everyone for watching. And we hope, really, we hope to have hope again. That was a lot of hopes. We hope to have hope again here at the Long Branch Free Public Library. So thank you everyone, and have a great night.